Today, I want to talk about economic growth. Economic growth.
Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, clearly wants economic growth, but how will she actually get it? Well, she did a big speech today outlining lots of policies the UK government's going to pursue. We will list them all and explain them in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And we're joined by Ben Chu, who used to do economics on Newsnight and now works for BBC Verify. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Adam.
And Dharshini David, OBE.
I know. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
How am I only finding out about this now?
I don't know. Maybe you're a month behind. I don't know.
How do these things happen?
I have yet.
Sorry, I don't mean to sound so grand. I don't mean like you. No, I just mean the actual process.
The actual process.
Yeah.
I'd love to know. You get nominated, you get vetted. People check you've not done anything wrong and bad in your history, and they clearly didn't uncover anything I didn't want them to. And then you suddenly get this mysterious letter.
Is that how it works? The letter lands on the doorstep, and was that the first time you had any inclination of it?
Totally. You get it about a month before the list comes out, and you get told, it's all very sort of, cloak and dagger. Sign this form if you want it, and then scan it and email it back, and then you get an automated reply. So you have no idea if you're going to be on this list or not. It's very, very. It could still be a scam. Who knows?
Was it for services to pithily summarising the point of Rachel Reeves' speech today?
I think it's the services of staring at spreadsheets. Services economics, they called it. But, growth. I counted them all up. 51 mentions of growth. And I don't know, this is going to show my age, isn't it? I thought of Bruce Springsteen and 57 channels and nothing on. Well, there's been nothing on when it comes to growth over the last 6 months, as far as we're aware. Pretty much flat. And the big question is, how are they going to achieve this number one mission? And we've suddenly had this revitalised Rachel Reeves for 2025 coming out there and telling us it's incredibly exciting and she has a plan. And that is why she's trying to convince us that, there is a plan. We're going to... And confidence has been a big problem for this government, of course, in the last few months because of what was unveiled in the budget. And in the run-up to the budget, we were told it was going to be hard. So this is kind of an attempt, really, she says, to kickstart growth. But when is it going to deliver?
I think we will look at the big picture kind of in the second half of this conversation. But the things that really leapt out for me from the speech were kind of the individual elements of that picture. Chris, the first one being, or the biggest one being, government support for a third runway at Heathrow Airport.
Yeah, I was sat just opposite the chief executive of Heathrow, and he said to me afterwards, actually, he regarded it as sort of Churchillian that a government was willing to say yes. And when I asked him, well, yes, but previous governments have made positive noises and it's never happened, so why would you believe this one? He said, and it's interesting because the government is leaning into this argument about the full plethora of stuff that they're announcing, that they've got a big majority and they're going to last at least one parliamentary term. In other words, there is the prospect that they've got the numbers to win arguments. As long as they have the stomach to win them, then they can press ahead and get on with stuff to the point, so those who hope that these various projects go ahead get to the point, even if they're not finished, and clearly the runway wouldn't be in that time frame, that they're sufficiently on that they're not going to get stopped. So I thought my takeaway from today was one of, yes, the government wanting to sound positive. Yes, they're trying to sort of turn the page on all of the gloomy stuff that Dharshini was talking about there, that critics flung around their necks in their opening months. But also that determination to say, well, hang on a minute, we do have this big majority. We can actually use it. We can get stuff done if we have the stomach to do it. And they were arguing today that they did. The test will be how that stomach feels when the criticisms start flowing, which they already have, and the arguments have to be won not just numerically but emotionally.
And let's hear how Rachel Reeves broke the news when she was doing her speech in Oxfordshire on Wednesday morning.
I can confirm today that this government supports a third runway at Heathrow and is inviting proposals to be brought forward by the summer. We will then take forward a full assessment through the Airport National Policy Statement. This will ensure that the project is value for money, and our clear expectation is that any associated surface transport costs will be financed through private funding.
Now, Ben, we'll get onto the pros and cons as people see this airport expansion stuff in a minute. But first of all, I'm a bit confused about what the government's actually said yes to today, because, I mean, we know that Heathrow, the company, is been in favour of building this runway for ages. I remember in 2018, as a much younger political correspondent, reporting on the vote in the Commons to approve the government position then being building the third runway. And then I vaguely remember in 2020, there was a court challenge that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, oh, this runway can go ahead. So I'm just wondering, what difference does today make?
Well, they're essentially saying we are going to back this project. And as you say, that's something that other governments have said in the past. But they're saying we really, really mean it. And we are going to back it because it fits with our growth agenda. As you said, it was gone to the courts. The courts have finally ruled that it can go ahead on those grounds. So that's not a problem. What will be a problem, as Chris was saying, is facing down all that opposition, some of which is already coming from within the Labour Party. Sadiq Khan said he will oppose it through any means that he can. That's going to be the real test. And I think it's important to recognise that, you know, previous governments have said this. This government wants to push ahead with growth because it's vital for their whole mission, really, as Rachel Reeves was articulating. And you can't do that. I think the significance of Heathrow was that it's just saying we are willing to take political pain to deliver this because it won't make a huge difference in this parliament, in all probability, you know, maybe even the next parliament, because these things take so long to do. But it does bring a whole lot of political grief on them. And I think what they're calculating is if we're sending a message to business, we're prepared to take this political pain. That just shows you how serious we are about everything we're saying about growth.
And Chris, that opposition came pretty quickly. In fact, it came in advance from Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, saying he's going to challenge us however he can.
Yeah, so you had protesters in the car park of this medical facility, Siemens Place in Oxfordshire, making an argument around climate change and their opposition to a third runway. And then, yeah, Sadiq Khan, Labour Mayor of London, being absolutely explicit and unflinching that he thinks on noise pollution, air pollution and climate targets reasons, it's not sustainable or viable to have a third runway, and he will argue the case against it all the way through, and if necessary in the courts. He acknowledges he's yet to see, you know, the proposal that Heathrow will put forward this time, but he is very much in the opposed camp. It's interesting that, broadly speaking, up to now, those senior Labour figures within the Parliamentary Labour Party, some of them in the Cabinet, not least Ed Miliband and Steve Reid, the Energy and Environment Secretaries, respectively, have sounded much more positive compared with their previous opposition to Heathrow expansion. They ultimately are in the government, and so collective responsibility kicks in. Sadiq Khan isn't, and so it doesn't.
And Ben, I mean, listening to those ministers on the airwaves of the last few days, they seem pretty convinced that they've managed to square the circle, that you can have the number of flights in the UK going up and the UK's carbon emissions overall coming down at the same time.
Yeah, well, this is going to be a really contentious point because the Climate Change Committee, which is the government's official climate watchdog, which is supposed to sort of say, are you sticking within your legislated carbon budgets, the caps on how much emissions nationally you can produce or not, they have said in the past that there should be no expansion of airports until there is a proper framework for this, and there should be no net expansion of particular airports unless you can guarantee that capacity will go down in other areas. So the government, as far as I know, isn't saying we're going to close down or reduce the capacity of regional airports. So it's a real question about whether this fits in with what that mandate is, what that command is from the Climate Change Committee. So we'll see in the next few days what they say about this, but that could be a real test for this government.
And Dharshini, do we know for a fact that building a third runway at Heathrow, whether it's in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, will make the economy much larger, a bit larger, significantly larger, the same?
The government's been sort of saying, look, there are various people who've done various forecasts, etc., to say that, yep, it will have a significant boost and outside of London and the South East. But anyone who does economic forecasting, anyone who's being upfront can tell you these numbers are highly uncertain and all sorts of things can happen to blow us off course and to increase those gains or reduce them. And as we were hearing, there's all sorts of trade-offs to consider as well. So I don't think we should take these things that seriously. Ultimately, does that mean more opportunities, particularly for businesses and for trade? Yes, quite potentially. But on the other hand, one group of economists were telling me today, well, you know, actually, you could see more people going abroad for the holidays, for example. And that could actually mean that overseas visits increase substantially more so than the number of people coming to the UK for leisure reasons. And we could be a loser in that sense. So there's all sorts of things to weigh out there.
But Chris, back to your point, I mean, it is a massive, giant symbol that actually probably would be visible from space about the direction the government wants to go in. And that has value beyond just the actual pounds and pence in GDP.
Yeah, I think it does, because symbolically it matters. Because granted, there are other things that critics of the government point out that the government could do that might have a significant bearing on growth. The Liberal Democrats make an argument, for instance, about a much closer economic tie with the European Union. But the government has ring-fenced off that as things they are willing to do, certainly as far as the big-ticket elements are concerned, the single market and the customs union. I think had Rachel Reeves given this speech and set out the various ideas, Oxford, Cambridge, the other ideas elsewhere around the country, and not addressed Heathrow, in other words, the government wasn't willing to commit to where it's got to, I guess one of the first questions, awkward folk like me would have asked would have been, well, what about Heathrow? Because that has been for so long this kind of cause célèbre infrastructure project that critics who've been desperate to see it happen have said is a classic example of how a project can get bogged down in legal action and a lack of political will and a million other things, that sort of bias towards the status quo argument that we're seeing the government prosecuting with sort of increasing kind of volume, that would have been thrown straight back at them and weakened substantially, I think, their overall case. So I think that matters politically. I think it also matters in a signalling sense, because they are conscious that lots of these projects, by their nature, are longer term. And, it's worth us saying, isn't it? Very often criticisms made of governments is that they are sort of genetically disposed to act in the short term, because that's where the electoral opportunities and dangers lie. Therefore, perhaps some credit is due when governments are willing to look to the long term beyond the potential window from which they might politically benefit. But there's a shorter term benefit too, because of that sense, certainly as far as Heathrow is concerned. There might be shorter term wins for some of the other projects, more specifically, in the coming months and years, that you are signalling that intent, that seriousness of purpose around channeling as much as you can within government towards economic growth, that perhaps businesses looking in, considering investment, etc., begin to believe it.
And Chris hinted there at one of the other announcements, which is support for the better transport connections between Oxford and Cambridge. And one of these phrases that has been uttered probably every year I've known about politics, which is creating the Silicon Valley of Europe in the UK, in between Oxford and Cambridge. Dharshini, why is that triangle, that slice of a particular bit of England, why are politicians so fixated on it? Decade after decade after decade.
Decade after decade, because there is so much untapped potential there, and it's hard to realise that, as you know, personally, that transport link is pretty abysmal. It takes you 3 hours to get between the two. And also, Oxford and Cambridge are particularly unaffordable places to live. So if you're trying to attract the brightest, the best, and there is the research facilities there and there's more happening there all the time, it's very difficult indeed. So these are the kind of bits of infrastructure you need to see put in place. But yet again, what the government wants to see delivered there is going to take a couple of decades. If you're graduating today, you're going to be pretty far along in your career before you actually feel the benefits of that, or indeed the economy feels the benefits. But as Chris was saying there, economists are looking at this saying this is actually to be applauded, a government with a long-term vision for growth. The markets are less excited today, we should say. They've hardly budged. And we know they've been very reactive to what Rachel Reeves has had to say in recent months, because they simply seem to be saying, OK, this sounds promising, but show us the money. You get those spades in the ground, start implementing these projects, then we might start believing you about growth.
And Chris, I'm not trying to sound like an old codger here and also tarring you with the same brush, but how many times have we done news stories as journalists about ministers saying, oh yeah, we need to improve the transport links between Oxford and Cambridge, and we need to build loads more houses outside Cambridge so that people can go and work in all the labs that they're going to build? Yeah,
completely. And it's the same with Heathrow as well, isn't it? Now, either that means that a splash of scepticism is justified, or if you're looking at it from the perspective of this government, and this is the big and we don't know the answer to it yet, they actually managed to pull it off, then they will be able to say, well, yes, lots of others tried and failed, and they've managed to actually do it. Now, the reason it's failed in the past often is because opposition to various ideas has been enough to, in a combination effect, put governments off it. There's a big old row in Oxfordshire about this idea of a new reservoir near Abingdon. Some people call it a megareservoir because it's so big, and there's lots of protests and campaigning against it. Similarly, some of the stuff in and around Cambridge might sound familiar because it kind of is. Some of it's in train already. Now it's a case of whether or not this government can turbocharge it or prevent it kind of running into the sand or not delivering versus how it was billed at the outset. So there's definitely a sort of familiarity to all of this. Now, if you look back at the sort of parliamentary numbers and the politics of the last 15 years, I mean, Newscast and Brexitcast have chronicled this every day. It's been a time of political turbulence. It's often been a time of governments not being certain about even their short-term future. And then it's been a time of big international kind of macro events that take up a lot of political bandwidth. And you think of Brexit and the referendum, and you think of COVID for just two, and there's others alongside those. In other words, the political landscape against which you might achieve other difficult stuff was difficult. That's not necessarily to excuse the limitations of previous governments, that plenty of people will have strong views pro or anti, but it is, I think, a reasonable description of the backdrop. Now, there's plenty of challenges this government faces, not least delivering economic growth, but they hope that these are the mechanisms via which they can nudge that along, and they hope that they have the political tools, the time and the majority to at least have perhaps a better chance of having a reasonable stab at it than some of the previous governments.
And Ben, this is a slightly philosophical question, but I sometimes think with these speeches, the politician giving them, they're at their most powerful as they're saying the words, and then the power starts ebbing away because you then remember that actually the global economy is governed by things like, does Donald Trump do to the UK what he threatened to do to Colombia at the weekend, which is to put massive tariffs on their exports to the US to get something else that he wants politically? Or does a little Chinese AI firm come up with a new model of AI that upends everyone's expectations about how much artificial intelligence is going to cost? And all that stuff happens outside the room where the Chancellor gave the speech.
There is no lever in the Treasury you can pull which says growth on it, and it will magically generate growth, not least because, as you say, there's lots of things that happen outside of the UK economy which affect the UK economy. It's quite interesting that Rachel Reeves was very clear in her speech that she wanted to work with President Trump, perhaps with an eye on that risk of tariffs landing on the UK, which would be very, very bad for her growth aspirations. In terms of the question of why it might be different this time, why there might perhaps be some hope, is that I think there is a dawning realisation right across the political spectrum, not just in the Labour, that growth has just been so bad for so long. And all the parties are saying we need growth, and there's disagreement about how to get it. But on the essential prescription, I think everyone is kind of lined up. So this isn't by any means to say that it's a done deal, that it will happen. But I sense the mood is slightly more, well, it's time to find solutions rather than just point to the reasons why it can't be done.
But there is one more factor, one more piece of this jigsaw, which is kind of hasn't really been mentioned today, which is business, right? And a lot of what was talked about today relies very heavily, of course, on the private sector to get that moving. Now, to get this vision on the road and keep it going and delivering, Rachel Reeves needs to enlist the private sector, right? How do you take people on that journey with you? How do you give them that confidence? Well, at the moment, a lot of businesses we hear from are saying we're just too busy worrying about these tax rises, the change in employee rights and how we sort of figure those out. And of course, we've got that chart in the middle of the OBR's book that came out of the budget, which says the budget measures are actually going to slow down growth in the private sector. So when you look at those kind of things, you think, well, could she have done this a slightly different way? Should she have shown this carrot to business, first of all, get them to buy into the vision and say, by the way, I'm going to have to tax you a bit more to get this going?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with increasing employers' national insurance contributions, business is angry about it, and there is a parallel universe where they weren't angry about it, and Rachel Reeves wasn't having to patch things up, and that is irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with the actual thing that she did with the tax rises. Dharshini, OBE, can I ask you another very big philosophical question? Like, what is a modern, cool, clever way of thinking about what the right amount of economic growth is? Because a few years ago, people were talking about degrowth. Actually, maybe we don't need any growth at all. And then you get politicians saying, no, we need as much growth as possible. But then equally, we have just had a period of very high inflation, and too much growth can cause inflation. And so that's bad too. So, like, what's the Goldilocks?
The Goldilocks situation.
And also then it's like an economy like Britain, with our size of our population and the structure of the economy, like what is the sweet spot for a country like this?
What is the sweet spot? Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
And I realise as soon as I say it's an impossible question to answer.
Yeah,
but
thanks for that.
Earn your OBE live here on Newscast.
Well, if you ask the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, you say, well, what does this mean when you say we're going for growth? They say, we want people to feel better off. Now, as you well know, I know that you've got your own collection of OBR books that you look at very closely.
Yes,
you will
treasured possessions.
Treasured possessions. Every single parliament in modern times, we've seen that happen. Living standards, when you look at sort of income per head, take away inflation, that has risen. But how do you get to that point where we're actually able to see growth go at a steady clip without the risk of, as you say, overheating, without the risk? I'm old enough now to remember, do you remember No Return to Boom and Bust that we had under Gordon Brown, right? And we thought for a while we cracked this, and we got to a stage of steady growth, and then along came the financial crisis, and guess what? Ever since then, our growth record has been in tatters.
What was it that Ed Balls called it in that
post-neoliberal endogenous growth theory?
Say that again, Ben.
Post-neoclassical endogenous growth theory.
Yeah, and what did that mean?
Oh, it's basically government intervention can make the economy grow faster than it would otherwise. So it was a kind of reaction to the government just needs to get out of the way philosophy of the 1980s.
Yeah. Anyway, Dharshini, what is this sweet number? What's the number?
Well, there is no one number. That sounds like an absolute get out, and it is. But what we've seen...
OBE for blagging.
If it works, do it. What we've seen in recent years, obviously, and this is, when we heard Rachel Reeves today talking about things like reform and investment, all of this is about basically raising our productivity game, right? Making us more efficient. And that's been the missing part of the puzzle in the last 15 years or so. Our productivity has done appallingly compared to the past, compared to other countries. And that is what you need to unlock if you can have faster growth and have sort of manageable inflation at the same time. So all of it depends on that, really, because at the moment we're not doing very well at all.
Just on the numbers, Adam, I think it is a really important question, because what are they aiming for here? I was looking at these today. So before the financial crisis, the UK was growing around 2.5% a year. We're projected by the Office of Budget Responsibility in the medium term, so by the end of this parliament, to be only growing by about 1.6%. Now, it may not seem like a huge difference between those two numbers, but over a long period, that really, really adds up in terms of the impact on the level of the growth, and also, therefore, the impact on our wages, our incomes, our general living standards. I think the government would like to go for something, get back to about 2.5%.
Which would be a stretch.
It would be a
long way from where we are.
Don't forget, Europe is really slow at the moment in terms of their growth. America's a real outlier in having growth anything like those levels. So we would be really bucking the trend if we got to 2.5%. But I suspect they'll really want to get something closer to that than what they are projected to get at the moment.
Although what they are projected to get at the moment, actually by the standards of the last 15 years, so post-financial crisis, ironically, isn't bad at all, which just goes to show how, frankly, we have lost speed.
And that cumulative thing working in reverse, I suppose. Just listening to your 2 points there, that, the accumulation of those apparently small gains can add up to quite a lot, but the lack of them over such a long period of time, I feel contributes to that sense of economic lethargy. And I think there's then a read across from that to a kind of political cynicism, that kind of sense of, can any political leaders make enough of a substantial difference that I feel better off? That kind of sentiment. The two, I think, are really tied in terms of the kind of national mood.
I think the big lesson, I've had 2 lessons, and I'm now going to tell you them both to try and get my OBE as well, is that I used to think, right, actually, no one notices growth that they were potentially going to have but which didn't materialise. Because it's not like Back to Future 2. You can't go and visit yourself in the future and see how richer you were if there hadn't been a financial crisis, or there hadn't been COVID, or there hadn't been the war in Ukraine and loads of inflation as a result. So you don't notice growth that didn't happen. But actually, people do have a sense of what growth was like in the past and what your parents, your grandparents, even yourself felt as your kind of trajectory. So I've learned that is a big lesson. And then the micro lesson I've learned in the last year or so is the threshold at which the Office for Budget Responsibility looks at government policy and actually incorporates it into their forecasts for what growth is going to be. Because all summer I was saying Rachel Reeves might get some instant growth from the OBR because of the announcements they're making about changes to the planning system. No, come the day of the budget, the OBR says those changes to the planning system aren't in law yet. They're just consultations. We ain't including them in our calculations. Your growth rate's going to be lower than we thought it was going to be before the budget. So I'm now kind of obsessed about how far has the government got in these first few months to satisfy the number crunchers at the Office of Budget Responsibility to incorporate actual government policy into their growth projections. So that's a macro point I've made and a micro point as I try and show off to our economist colleagues. They love the macro and the micro.
You convinced me, but then I'm not an economist.
Right, Chris, very quickly, just before you go, I noticed your question to Rachel Reeves was along the lines of, does she have a plan B for if this doesn't work? What did you make of her answer?
I thought what was interesting, so I tried to sort of frame it in that kind of context of the last generation, financial crisis, COVID, conflicts around the world, the kind of contributors, if you like, to the economic malaise, as well as that big geopolitical shift of the last quarter of a century, which is the rise of China. And interestingly, she was saying, and actually this is a great thing for you, Ben and Dharshini, to kick around. She was trying to make an argument in her reply. She kind of acknowledged those contributory factors, those knocks to our economy, which obviously have had impacts on other similar Western economies too. But that sense from her that the UK up until now has been disproportionately hit, or perhaps less capable of bouncing back as quickly as other comparable economies. And I thought that was an interesting critique, but off the top of my politically focused rather than economically focused head, certainly beyond these shores, I found myself pondering how legitimate and reasonable a case is that.
Well, we shall let our economist colleagues ponder that because we're running out of time on this episode of Newscast. Luckily, Newscast will go forever, so we've got plenty of other episodes to see how that goes. Chris, thank you very much.
Ta.
Ben, thank you to you.
Thank you, Adam.
And Dharshini, thanks as well.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.